Okay, so this is Marci Kwon. Can we give Marci a round? I'm so excited to welcome Marci to our class. So I'm going to give a brief bio, and then also I'm going to talk about an amazing working group that Marci's a part of and that she's hosting on Friday, and then we'll turn it over to Marci. So Professor Marci Kwon is an assistant professor in art history. She specializes in the art and culture of the United States. Her research and teaching interests include the intersection of fine art and vernacular practice, theories of modernism, cultural exchange between Asia and the Americas, welcome, folk and self-taught art, and issues of race and objecthood. She's actually teaching a class on objecthood this quarter, which basically looks at the large questions of what does it mean to be an object through an art history, critical race history, and other lenses. She's also teaching Asian American art from 1850 to the present this quarter. And you should really take a class with Marci. Like, that's just my personal plug, but please just actually, she teaches some of the most important work in art history and the intersections of critical race in art history. Marci is a recipient of numerous awards and fellowships, and she has held positions at the Met Museum and the Whitney Museum of American Art. And in 2016, she spearheaded the Association of Critical Race Art History's Bibliographic and Reading Group Initiative. And that is this event. This is an unofficial flyer, but this event, which is happening on Friday. Friday, November 17th from 1 to 3 p.m. in Building 360. It's a part of CSRE. And if you're really interested in art history, but also interested in the ways that art history and critical race theory intersect, and finding more language for being in that space and doing work in that space, I think this is going to be a wonderful, amazing working group for you to be a part of. And you can check out that group on Friday, this Friday, from 1 to 3 in CSRE's conference room. And this particular discussion, I think Marci will talk about it a little bit more, but it's going to be a discussion on In the Wake, on Blackness and Being. And if you RSVP for that event, let me know, and we'll send you the reading for that event. Great. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Marci Kwon, Professor Marci Kwon.
Thank you, Wong, for that kind introduction. Thank you all for being here. Hi, Bernard. I'm sorry. The first like 15 minutes are going to be very similar to something you've already heard, because Bernard is my Asian American art course. It's really a pleasure to be here and an honor to be here at Alon and Jeff's invitation. I know all of you are in this room and thus know how wonderful and important IDA is in terms of a space and community. But it is a place that made me feel really welcome. I've only been at Stanford for about 1.5 years. And I would kind of echo and say that, you know, Alon is doing some of the most important work on campus. So I guess in a serendipitous turn of events, I'd like to start off by doing an exercise in collective art making together that has to do with, as Alon said, perhaps everything except for the immediate cognitive rational function of your brain. And this is a work by Yoko Ono from her poem book, Grapefruit, thank you. Light's great, I think, actually. From her book, Grapefruit, and it's called Earth Peace. And so what I'd like everyone to do is, I'd like to invite you to close your eyes. It's from spring of 1963. Listen to the sound of the earth turning. Do you all hear it? You can open your eyes. So as I mentioned, this is a work that was published in Yoko Ono's Grapefruit from 1963, a work where she invites us all to experience and imagine and co-create works of art with her, such as the one we just did. And here you really see Yoko Ono kind of distributing the process of creation, distributing the process of art making from herself to her audience. And so when Alana asked me to talk about pedagogy and kind of alternative or radical pedagogies, I guess, as an art historian, I began to wonder what are some of the pedagogies that artists themselves can teach us. What are the pedagogies contained in a work of art like this? And certainly in this case, it's something to do with the power of imagination. The power of making the impossible, of actually hearing the earth turn, and suddenly materializing that as possible. And kind of very briefly, to start, I guess I just want to talk about this notion of imagination, and this notion of generosity as well, which I think is embedded in Yoko Ono's gesture. This generosity of decentering herself and thinking solely about her audience. And those are two things that have kind of helped me think through a question that I get a lot as an art historian, which is, to be honest, a predominantly kind of white, male-dominated field. And that question is, of course, why are you an art historian? What good can art do in the world? Especially when there's so much violence and hatred and racism, art wouldn't seem to appear to be engaging directly in the political realm. Just kind of going into your head and thinking about something as impossible as hearing the earth turn might seem to be impossible. But here, I guess, what I want to do in the kind of first 15 minutes or so of this lecture is to think with the artist Yoko Ono, and to think of how, I see this operating in her practice in concert with my own life and my own practice as an art historian, as a scholar. And then to give you an example, to kind of shift gears in the second half of the lecture, to think through a kind of case study of an artist whose work I've seen that moved me recently, and what I find in his work. So, just very briefly, to start, this is a work by Yoko Ono from 1971. The title is announced, in fact, in this advertisement, in which she's actually dropped out a space in the facade that says Museum of Modern Art, and has herself on the side walking by with a bag that says F, so Museum of Modern Art becomes Museum of Modern Fart. And so this is, I think really suggestive of Ono's kind of irreverent, incredibly kind of conceptual, funny practice, in which she actually did not have a one-woman show at MoMA from December 1st to December 15th, but in fact ran ads in the Village Voice in order to kind of advertise her one-woman show, which consisted of instructions actually that go with these photographs, which I'll read you. It read, "Flies were put in a glass container the same volume as Yoko's body. The same perfume as the one Yoko uses was put in the glass container, and the container was then placed in the exact center of the museum. The lid was opened, the flies released. A photographer who had been invited over from England, specifically for the task, is now going around the city to see how far the flies flew. The flies are distinguishable by the odor which is equivalent to Yoko's own. Join us in the search, observation, and flight." And so what this, again, involved was Ono actually ostensibly putting a volume of flies in this glass jar that would seem to match the volume of her own body, then spraying perfume and letting them free. It's kind of recasting the artist's body as kind of distributed across these flies that would then kind of roam into the city and then further kind of distribute her own personhood through a kind of eruption of scent, right? And here she is standing next to it in the courtyard of the Museum of Modern Art. But what I really love about this piece is the last part, the impossibility of it, right? This idea that a photographer has been invited over to track down every single fly. And in fact, you know, inviting us to join that search, but also thinking about the way that this task of actually documenting where the flies went, again, would be absolutely impossible. But Yoko allows us to think it's so. And this piece did have political ramifications as well. Here you see the ad actually taped up in the Museum of Modern Art's window because people actually came by MoMA asking, you know, where's the Yoko Ono show? And you'll notice that it's the ad taped up and in ink, not here. So the artist is definitively not here. She's not allowed into the walls of the museum. And that's another kind of impossibility that she makes possible by thinking and distributing these flies and allowing them to kind of roam the New York cityscape, which gives you a sense, I think, of, you know, the obvious hilarity and wit and intelligence of this conceptual art practice, but also of the fact that she's, you know, aware of the larger structures in which she's operating. Yoko Ono was born in Japan, was raised in Tokyo, and was only a few years old when the atomic bombs dropped. And she remembers actually having to go out from the city into the countryside and gather food in a wheelbarrow in order for her family to live and survive. And her father was put in a kind of like holding rehabilitation center where he stayed for 5 years, the family not knowing where they were. The entire family moved to New York when Ono was 18, and she attended Sarah Lawrence College. And so again, you know, something as humorous and light as this ends up when you begin looking at the entire situation to have an immense amount of gravitas, which reminds us, I think, also of the title of the book, Where Earth Peace, which you all just experienced and created together with us, originated as grapefruit. She said she liked it because it's a hybrid of a lemon and orange. So this hybrid idea, you know, perhaps thinking about her own trajectory, but also thinking about the way in which a grapefruit combines the sweet and sour of life into a single large rind-covered fruit filled with flesh. So Ono as a malodorous eruption, a fart, scent, here takes another form in her work done around the same year, Posterity piece, in which which remained unrealized, very sadly, but the instructions for this piece is all about butts, specifically, butts for world peace, which she instructs that every person who attends the opening of her exhibition has their butt photographed and then displayed on the wall, quote, for world peace. And so there's this sense, again, of the different kinds of posteriors, you know, the beauty, but also the impossibility of identifying someone by their posterior unless one had an incredibly intimate relationship with them. And again, the kind of impossibility of this piece of thinking of us not in terms of our bodies or our skin color or national heritage, but in terms of what we all have, our butts. And then here are two other works by Ono, two incredibly moving works, I think. She was this you know, very well-known conceptual artist at this moment, including the work on the left, Painting to See in the Dark. And you'll notice it's just this piece of canvas. And the seeing in the dark part comes because in order to see in the dark, what do? You press your face to something. And so you can see there's this almost kind of embedded oil stained on the canvas, as if bearing the indexical impression of every person who came into the canvas to feel, or into the gallery, to feel the canvas across their cheek. Experiencing it again, not through visuality, but through the other senses. So I swear, Alana and I didn't plan this. And on the right, shadow painting, which is this simply another piece of canvas put next to a window, a particularly bright window in which light kind of streamed across throughout the day, and shadows eventually came and played across the canvas. So a work that is, again, kind of extending beyond itself, extending beyond the artist, but allowing the environment, the play of light and shadow, of absence and presence to kind of form ephemeral compositions across its surface. Another piece, in a similar vein, this is marble piece. What do you think happened here? I mean, I think that, one thing about works of art is you get so much information by just looking at them, about how they were made, about the kind of the process, the materials. So I was wondering, what do you all think about something like this? How would you guess it was made, I guess? Yeah.
Oh, I was wondering if it was like smeared at all.
Yeah, there's definitely a kind of application of ink, right? And there's a kind of gradual, as you say, like kind of smearing of brush strokes into this solid black. What are the materials? And perhaps what do they remind you of? It's close to a book, right? It kind of folds out and extends out. So what this was is it's actually, I think, evoking a kind of Asian scroll as well, a Chinese scroll, and it's done in sumi ink, which is a kind of water-based ink where you get this beautiful fluid black color. And so you get a sense of the fluidity in the movement of the brush across this various panel. And actually what this was originally a blank white panel in which Yoko put a bowl of ink and a few paintbrushes and invited people to paint onto it. And so you can see this is actually not a single author again, but the amalgamation of many people's authorship working together to transform a humble piece of paper into a sheet of marble, an almost kind of miraculous transfiguration of materials that allows something so humble to take on the characteristics of something hard and enduring, something beautiful, another kind of possible transformation. But perhaps most of you know Yoko best from her kind of image. She was deeply cool and embedded into the kind of counterculture of the 1960s, and in the 1960s was invited to London to stage a show at Indica Gallery, which included the work on the right, where you had one person climbing a ladder. Only one person could experience this work at a time, and they'd actually look through a magnifying glass at the top of the platform, which just revealed the word yes. And this very famously and probably apocryphally is how Yoko Ono first met John Lennon. Seen here in his kind of Beatles, Ed Sullivan, great mop top haircut phase in the early 60s, and then later in the kind of more hippie counterculture with his wire rim specs. And ostensibly, climbing up and seeing that yes piece is where John fell in love with Yoko. And, in my own experience, my first encounters with Yoko were through John, always through the lens of John. She was John's husband. She was the woman who broke up the Beatles, right? But as I got to learn more about her practice and her commitments, I have to say that John is her husband. It's not the other way around. But they married and were political activists, using John's intense celebrity for pieces such as this. This is Bed In for Peace, in which they actually sat in a hotel room for 2 weeks and took interviews, not moving, surrounded by flowers, and there should be a dove cage with a real dove there somewhere. And actually, giving interviews, playing music in order to kind of raise awareness, because of course this is the moment of the Vietnam War, a war that sparked so many protests against American imperialism and colonialism, French imperialism and colonialism, and here they are seeming to do nothing but sit in bed, but trying to draw attention to the struggles, right? And here are two other works they produced together. War is Over If You Want It, Love and Peace, from John and Yoko. A version of this poster ran in the New York Times on December 27th. So it was envisioned as a Christmas gift, a holiday gift to the rest of the world. And in fact, it was splashed on billboards around, in countries around the world, asking us to imagine war being over. Again, something so seemingly impossible to imagine at this point of a kind of protracted, intense struggle, but reminding us perhaps that it's in our power, if we imagine it, to change it. And to show you a piece of the way Yoko kind of, I guess, gets demonized and becomes this kind of central figure to Asian American femininity in particular. This is a work by one of my heroes, another one of my heroes, Teresa Hak-Kyung-cha, who wrote Dictée. Many of you have probably read it. It's a kind of novel in which she is exploring her own life and kind of poetry in terms of in Korean, English, and French, so in 3 different languages, so as a kind of cross-translational medium. She's from Berkeley, made amazing performance pieces at Berkeley. But here she shreds her words and gives them body, you know, putting them into a small cup as if they were a tangle of ramen noodles. And part of the passage that is within this cup, both legible and illegible, there and material, is part of her poem Hey Yoko, which goes, Hey Yoko Ono, I ain't no, I ain't your Yoko Ono. To suggest that someone hailed her, someone called her Yoko Ono on the street, you know, she's totally different ethnicity, but suggesting again the kind of role that Yoko Ono takes on in popular culture, right, as a kind of avatar for Asian American women. But here she's kind of not redressing it, you know. How does one actually fix that moment of being hailed as the other, right? But using it as the medium for her own art, kind of making it material and shredding it and transforming it into something else, something that I think still captures the pain, but perhaps tries to ingest it and digest it in a different way, like noodles. So I'm going to end this, I guess, brief section by thinking just about another one of Yoko Ono's works. This is called Fly, from summer of 1963. So here we have the pun, fly, you know, insect or command, insect or verb. And when I think of flying, I guess I think of travel and migration. And my own family, so my grandfather in the middle, who came to the United States after the Korean War and after the border, the North Korean border, had kind of closed behind him, leaving his entire family there. And I think about the fact that he was separated, he never saw his parents again, separated from his brother for 40 years, but came to the United States because he met an American soldier, and actually first came to Canada and called up every single college in the phone book in his broken English in order to try to get a college scholarship. And he eventually was given one at a very, very, very small evangelical school in Kentucky. And so I guess, you know, what Yoko Ono allows me to think or do is to imagine impossibilities and try to think about how they might end up kind of transforming my own life or my own artistic imagination. And so here is my grandfather next to a car that is not his, because he didn't own a car at this time. In the South, you know, there's a very interesting and I think complex history of the racialization of Asian Americans in the South, how they were colored, but they were neither black nor white. And so they were allowed into segregated spaces. And I think about him kind of navigating that impossible space at this time. But I also think about him in terms of one of my favorite works of art, Robert Frank's The Americans from 1953. It was actually done the same year my grandfather came to the United States, so I always associate those two things together. It's a photo book that Frank kind of went across the United States taking pictures of everyday Americans. And I always had this fantasy for a while that like he somehow like encountered my grandfather in Kentucky in '53 and took a picture of him. And then I actually traced around and was like, no, that didn't happen. But I guess what this tells me or what this gives me is what Yoko has given me, which is that thinking of possibilities matter. And yes, while I can't ever, you know, rewrite my grandfather into Robert Frank's The Americans, there's still something important, and there's still a kind of sense of potentiality or possibility within that. And that to me is, I guess, what art gives me. So I just spoke a lot for a while. And I have a kind of second section of this where I'm going to talk about the artist Martin Wong, a kind of queer Chinese artist who is like my favorite artist. But
Show Up Now.
Yeah,
in Berkeley.
Yeah, it's a Show Up Now at Berkeley, and I wrote something for that show for a symposium probably about the show. But for now, I wanna see if there are any responses or questions or disagreements or anything that you know. I guess what I just told you, this kind of very brief introduction to myself and the art I care about, kind of tells you. Would you like to talk about? So, yeah, questions, comments? Yeah.
In terms of thinking about imagining possibilities, how does that translate into the way that you teach and like the pedagogy that you bring to your students?
That's a really good question. Bernard, what do you think? I'm actually curious because I think it's important to, yeah.
Yeah, so art, this is my first time taking an art history class, and I think at the beginning I struggled a lot with like understanding like, why the discipline, what it brought, and I'm a philosophy background, so I like to do a lot of theory, but it's much more blunt with what the boundaries are in philosophy. And kind of thinking about like activism and the worlds in which activists try to create, it involves imagining possibilities over what's normal. I think that's like super, super difficult to do because there's so many things that are just normalized in our society. And so like looking at works like Grapefruit or that we've seen, we just I think came from like Jackson Pollock like 2 weeks ago.
Yeah.
And then if I had seen that at the beginning of the quarter, I would have really not known what to have done with that. But over the course of the class and your teaching, I think I've been a lot more open to using imagination and like thinking about like the absences as well as the presences. In order to understand works of art.
Yeah, you're gonna make me cry. Thank you. That's like, I mean, and I really appreciate that. I guess for me, you know, one of the challenges of the class is that it starts in 1850, and that's really important to me because it starts with Chinese railroad immigration, or the Chinese railroad labor, coolie labor, the kind of the history, the early history of immigration to the United States, and the way, in fact, that connected with the abolition of slavery. I mean, it's almost contemporaneous. That's why there's this huge influx of Chinese immigrants. Part of the reason why to California at this point. But I think what's hard about that. And what's really hard emotionally for me in the beginning of the course is like, well, it's like, well, where are those voices that you want to kind of, not resist, but where are the kind of alternative narratives embedded? And what does it mean when you don't have an archive? or you don't have people who are given the time or space to create work, because they're like literally like blasting through rock. And so I guess for me, that kind of imagining the possibilities or impossibilities means understanding that the archive itself and what is valued is itself constructed. And so by kind of moving outside of traditional boundaries of knowledge, we can begin to understand and account for, if not ever redress, because I don't think it's possible to redress, notions of absence. Are there any other questions?
Yeah. I was just wondering what you meant, like on the very first slide, for every letter is
Oh yeah, that's part of the second, and so I'll talk a bit about that. But just to give you a sense, so I'm about to read an academic paper I wrote in the form of a love letter, but that title actually comes from Chris Krause's I Love Dick, which is this kind of amazing book. Yes, but she's actually in love with a guy named Dick. It's this amazing book that really it is written in epistolary form as well, and is kind of thinking through the ways in which in this kind of intense masculine theorizing, what gets left out in terms of that. And so that's my kind of subtle homage to Chris Krause.
And I just love how much you illuminated what gets left out just through Yoko's artistic practice. And I just love the audacity of her putting an ad into the newspaper and like willing that show into existence.
She literally willed it, exactly, into existence. And this dialectic of absence and presence then becomes a little, I think, more complicated, right? Because it's not just about visibility, it's not just about kind of placing your body there, but it's also about acknowledging the larger structural limitations that allows your body to be there. And that in fact contains and objectifies us, right? And so that's an attempt to evade all of that, and to perhaps imagine, as Bernard was saying, possibilities other than the ones we're given. I always say with art, like the reason I study art is because it's the one place I'm allowed to be as complex as I feel. It's like everything else feels like has been my options feel like they've been predetermined for me academically or in terms of my gender or my ethnicity or all those things, my background, my family, and in my own writing and when I look at art, it's like I think because it is coming in realms other than linguistic, and is forcing me to translate that into other mediums, like that kind of complexity is there, and so I know, I guess it's possible. Any other questions? Yeah.
Okay. Do you think that like Yoko Ono's like avatarness or like icon-ness in terms of like what you're talking about to like the Asian American woman detracts anything from her or all that she's done? Like the
That's a really, really good question and one I think about a lot, right? I mean, I think what you're asking is like, the fact that she becomes this kind of symbol of Asian America, like does that detract anything from her? And I think that this is a larger kind of question about what we do with works of art, and the fact that they circulate beyond the control of or intention in which they're originally created, or of the artist's intention or biography, and can sometimes be put to pernicious use. For example, hardening into a stereotype. And I guess for me, that circulation and that kind of hardening of the work is really upsetting and I think really violent. But I don't think it's the fault of the work, it's the fault of the system in which it circulates. And this is not to say that all works of art are innocent, that they just that some of them don't like court that or aren't participating in that. But I think in the case of minoritarian cultural production, it's always going to circulate in a system that just wants to flatten it into one thing. And so I guess what I'm interested in is how we kind of recover the complexity, not of the original intent, but the complexity of the way it can continue to signify in other ways, right? Or do other work. Without brushing aside the kind of real harm that something like that can do. So this is a bit of an experiment. I've never written a paper like this. I'm going to sit down for it. But I also want to say that this is, I think, getting at some of I think a lot of the complexities that attend art and art making at this moment, which gets to your question, which I think has to do around cultural forms and cultural appropriation. So I guess this was my attempt to kind of think through some of those questions, although I'm still thinking through that. So every letter is a love letter. Dear Martin, I love you. Although we never met, I feel like I knew you. Maybe it's because your paintings are like bodies. The red acrylic of your bricks built up, stroke by meticulous stroke until they feel like flesh. Standing in front of the Big Heat from 1988, which I think is the first work by you I ever saw, although I can't really remember for sure, feels like standing in front of another person. Brick walls block, but here the ruined building quivers with the intensity of the gentle lip lock below, whose tenderness seems to emanate upward, staining the wall with romantic smudges of pastel paint. I love this painting, but for all its gentleness and idealism, its picturing of a gay fantasia on national themes, to quote Tony Kushner, it's not why I love you. Rather, I love you because you understand that love is not all hearts and butterflies and pastel paint. Love is complicated, painful, and even violent. I think you love the Angels of Light, Hibiscus's mystical queer performance troupe, and I think they loved you. You made remarkable things for them, such as the intricate set designs and costumes for Paris sites under the bourgeoisie, think about that for a second, and Myth Thing. The golden peaks and flowing black lines of your set remind me of Five Dynasties landscape painting, whose calligraphic washes of paint express both the harmony of nature and the poetic refinement of the literati. Your set makes a gift of your own refinement and worldview, a backdrop for the antic actions and lavish costumes before it. The Coquettes, the forerunners to Angels of Light, also loved China. You never worked with them, but I suspect that your way of loving, and I suspect their way of loving China had something to do with this. As Julia Bryan-Wilson has recently detailed, the Coquettes staged a number of body productions, such as Peking on Acid and Pearls Over Shanghai, that took aim at any form of political correctness or propriety, meaning they performed in yellowface. Composer Link Martin defended these productions by citing his childhood fascination with San Francisco Chinatown. But his Chinatown was not your Chinatown. His Chinatown was a place he occasionally visited to take in the exotic architecture, to eat a plate of chop suey at Charlie Lowe's. Maybe you also ate a plate of chop suey at Charlie Lowe's, but you lived just a few blocks away on Union Street above a Chinese laundry. Your Chinatown was the Chinatown of the 1850s, a place for newly arrived Chinese immigrants to congregate, eat, and shop. Yet even in the 19th century, Chinatown was also a curiosity for those who lived outside of it. As historian Philip Choi has noted in his indispensable guide to the city's architecture, a number of wealthy Chinese merchants were already planning to transform Chinatown into a destination for exotic goods and sites at the time of the 1906 earthquake. The subsequent rebuilding of the quarter in a style that one might call pagoda pastiche was due to their efforts, as well as the San Francisco Real Estate Board's recommendation that Chinatown be rebuilt, quote, with fronts of Oriental and artistic appearance. It was only by cladding itself in the curved eaves and bright paint, external signs of difference that signaled economic power, its willingness to be consumed, that Chinatown could lay claim to the 8 blocks which had been occupied for the past 50 years and prevent being moved to the hinterlands of San Francisco, i.e. Bayshore. You love Chinatown, both despite and because of the fraught history of its ornamental flourishes. Chinese Telephone Exchange from 1992 embraces these contradictions. The painting is organized like a postcard, framed by the name and address, and an inset with the exchange's pagoda pastiche exterior at the upper left corner, and a dramatic central scene of the building's opulent interior, all shining wood, lattices, and scrolls. The 3 women who sit at the switchboard seem to melt into the scene, the golden embroidery of their garments flowing into the trim around the switchboard, the thick ornament adorning the room's wooden panels, and the dials of the 2 rotary telephones that frame the scene. These phones impart the scene with a dramatic perspective while also thematizing the picture's sense of connection. Indeed, it was the telephone operators themselves who were the main draw for tourists to SF Chinatown. As Choi recounts, by the 1930s, 24 operators handled upwards of 14,000 calls per day, which came at a rapid pace in multiple Cantonese dialects. The room's adornment makes tangible this connection, golden filaments seeming to glow with the voices they carry. Despite your claims that you painted all of your San Francisco Chinatown paintings from memory, you never witnessed this scene. The Chinese Telephone Exchange closed in 1948 when you were just 2 years old. The painting is not a memory, but a work of historical imagination, a recasting of exoticizing ornament as a form of connection rather than alienation. I will never have full access to Chinatown, not just because I'm of Korean descent, but that's a part of it. Rather, it's because this place, like any other place, is defined by private spaces, tucked away from public entry and eyes. In a painting like Chinese Telephone Exchange, or even your iconic My Secret World, I think you're telling me that exteriors cannot exist without interiors, that they are connected, much as the brick and the windows in this painting are placed on the same plane. I realized just how much I would never see of Chinatown when I first encountered Frank Wong's remarkable dioramas at the Chinese Historical Society. Wong, no relation, also grew up in Chinatown, and beginning in the 1990s, created scenes of Chinatown's public and private spaces whose miraculous intricacy is indebted to his experience as a Hollywood prop master. Like your paintings, Frank Wong's dioramas are based on memories on the Chinatown of his childhood of the 1940s. Christmas shows the living room of a house during the holidays, and it's crammed full of telling details. The Christmas tree mounted with ornaments gently sagging under its own weight, the Cantonese Opera cover, whose program announces the year of the scene, 1941, as well as an efflorescence of objects including golden scrolls, ink landscape paintings, and a ceramic Buddha that might be derided as orientalizing kitsch, were one to see them on the shelves of Chinatown's many souvenir shops. You had a number of similar Buddhas in your now legendary collection of some 4,000 odd things. These rotund laughing figures give the fantasy of Chinatown material form. Such objects migrate from public to private, interior to exterior, Chinatown to the city that's surrounding it, embodying the permeability of the membranes that would seem to separate these spaces. Here's Martin Wong's collection. Despite the coquette's attempts to abstract China into a fantasy, their show was also built on Chinatown's material legacy. As legend had it, the Coquettes got their start during a midnight rep film screening at the Pagoda Palace, always called the Palace in the literature, a theater that opened in 1967 to show Chinese language films. Located in North Beach, just outside the official geographic boundaries of Chinatown, the theater was one of many venues that provided Chinese language entertainment to its denizens, beginning with the Cantonese opera houses of the 19th century. By the 1940s, when films based on Cantonese opera became more common, movie theaters also hosted the occasional opera performance, and opera houses began to show films. That the Pagoda Palace also hosted Cantonese opera performances is evidenced by a lighthearted moment in the recent Coquettes documentary, when members reminisce about stealing a trunk of opera costumes from the theater. Although presented as an irreverent prank, their loss was likely a huge blow for the performers that owned them, who relied upon these opulent costumes to create their characters and public identities. The uproar was such that the Coquettes had to pay the theater back for the lost costumes. I'm still working out what happened to these costumes, but the theft points to the heretofore overlooked importance of Cantonese opera to both the Coquettes and their offshoot, the Angels of Light. The Angels formed after Hibiscus grew weary of the Coquettes' success and formed a performance troupe that would return to the project's anti-commercial and spiritual roots. In 1974, you designed both the poster and set design for What's Sui, a production which was actually performed here at Stanford in the Jerry Garcia Theater, which is no longer called that. They're rebuilding it into something else. And the production featured a remarkable costume by Tahara, which took a Cantonese opera costume as its base. Sequins and fringe and opaque tempera paint and acid green, orange, and red have been applied on top of the cream silk, obscuring the original's design. And the 4 pennants bursting from the shoulders identify this as a new cowl, or women's armor worn by female generals. Despite the vast chasm of purpose and ideology that separates the Coquettes from the Angels, their common use of Cantonese opera costumes suggests that their love was possessive. They digested that which was other, bringing it into themselves and making it their own, a part of themselves. On one hand, this was a source of their tremendous creative power, but you, Martin, had a different way of expressing your love. As you once wrote to Hara, quote, "I love you, but I could never be a part of you." Your love eschewed possession and easy identification, acknowledging your apartness. For me, the most moving part of the Coquettes documentary was seeing you in the background of Hibiscus's crucifixion, which marked his departure from the group. Clad in denim, you stand back, loving through presence rather than possession. But even your love comes with the risk of mistranslation. Take your use of fingerspelling, which you use to spell out all manner of phrases, including Starry Night, the title of this picture. Within deaf culture, fingerspelling comprises just a small part of ASL, a vibrant form, language, and culture that also incorporates movement and facial expressions into a tapestry of enormous richness and complexity. I understand your use of fingerspelling is stemming from your fascination with the conjunction of image and language. Chinese characters, graffiti, and constellations, you often layer these languages on top of each other, like a Rosetta Stone that extends from street to sky. And yet for someone nearly fluent in ASL and familiar with deaf culture, such as the art historian Carl Metzger, who helped me think through key aspects of this paper, this use of fingerspelling hews dangerously close to the Coquettes' possession of Chinese culture. Like the Coquettes and Angels, however, your engagement with deaf culture contained a material dimension. You found fingerspelling in a New York subway, purchasing a card featuring an alphabet from a man identifying himself as deaf mute. Like the porcelain Buddha that sits on your shelf, these small slips of paper are deceptively simple. They are at once reductions of deaf culture and language, emblems of need, but also, in the case of the one you received, a gesture of connection. What do I mean by a gesture of connection? Let me try to explain. Last week, I spoke at a symposium devoted to a remarkable retrospective, actually this was a couple weeks ago, at the Berkeley Art Museum. During the Q&A, the moderator asked about your paintings of San Francisco Chinatown and New York Chinatown.
One of the panelists described these works as a play on stereotypes of Chinese people running laundromats. The comment follows a common line of criticism of your Chinatown works as engaging with a kind of ironic self-orientalism. But in this painting, which is in the show, I'd never seen it before, you take pains to show that Chinese laundry is a real place, including an address, 347 East 5th Street, and indicating its location just a few blocks from your East Village apartment. Most notably, you include a portrait of your parents inside the laundry, which includes the following note at the bottom edge of the painting. Quote, portrait of the artist's parents who met at Rita's laundromat on Union Street in San Francisco. For you, the stereotype of the Chinese laundry was no mere image, but just the place you lived. Martin, I have another story to tell you. Like you, I lived in California before moving to New York for over a decade. A few months before I was due to move back to California, I visited your retrospective at the Bronx Museum. In my 13 years in the city, I had never once encountered anyone passing out these finger-swelling cards. But of course, on my way home from the museum, someone finally offered me one. There it is. I have it in my wallet if anyone wants to see it. Martin, baby, you and me, were written in the stars. Thank you. So I'd be happy, got a little more time on this process?
We have 20 minutes.
Okay, so I'd be happy to take questions, comments, thoughts about Wong. Everyone should just go see the show. That's like the most important thing. It's amazing, amazing work. The detail is like incredible in person. Do you like the work?
About the format of your reflection.
Yeah.
Why did you choose to write it as a love letter?
Yeah, I mean, I think like, it's a good question. I think I had been reading the Chris Kraus. I think that it just felt appropriate for his work because his work, I think, really elicits an intense affection, love, connection, and he himself, I mean, you know, at the symposium there were a lot of people who knew him. He died of AIDS, and they all loved him deeply. I think that's the kind of, I guess, I would say, like, undergirding ethos of his practice is, you know, I think it's really easy to see this as perhaps making fun or self-orientalizing or ironizing, but his parents are in the window of this, and so I guess like that kind of real connection is something I wanted to also kind of think through in terms of my own practice as an art historian. And I think the love carries through to the fracture of the painting as well. You probably can't tell, but the painting is so detailed and lovingly applied. There's incredible kind of shading and pastel. You can really see that in the gradings, for example. This is not just a kind of interior. He's paying attention to it like he pays attention to skin, for example, and giving it the kind of richness and complexity and depth and kind of texture of anything else he might paint. He does that with bricks too. He paints thousands of bricks and they're each individually painted. So I guess I would say that one, as you know, in terms of like my scholarship, I try to match my tone and my own practice to the work that I write about. And I guess in terms of pedagogy, I would say that this kind of investment, the kind of, I think, research and knowing, because I think it's really easy to see these paintings and just be like Chinatown, like whatever, like weird, like orientalizing tourist trap. But I think what art historical research does for me is allow you to see the complexities of a place, you know, the lived experiences of a place. And I guess that would be the thing that I think about in terms of my own pedagogy, is trying to never just kind of fall into the stereotypes, but understand that if an artist painted something, they typically did so as a means of exploring it and with an incredible depth of connection to that particular subject matter. And I try to, again, match that connection in my own work, although it'll never, you know, the work is always smarter and more intricate and more subtle and richer than anything I could ever do. So it's just one iteration of this.
We usually taught that our academic gestures, especially like deep critical work, should be separate from our artistic work.
It's impossible.
So I
it's
so
like
deeply appreciate you modeling.
Yeah, it's like literally, I think we all, I mean, like, I remember, so when I was at like some conference and some graduate students came up to me, and they're, you know, graduate students of color, they wanted to talk, and they were like, yeah, like we want to work on like issues of race or ethnicity, but like my advisor just says it's like research. And I was like, we're all doing research. Like we all are drawn to the topics we're drawn to and like spend time thinking about the things we're doing because we are who we are. And I think it's better to acknowledge that than try to cover it over in a kind of false layer of objectivity. So I care a lot about that in my, I guess, my scholarship. And in my pedagogy too.
You talk, just flesh out a little bit, just gestures of connection, just as a term that you use.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it gets fraught with something like this, right? Or with the kind of ornament that I was talking about, because I think that, you know, when I was talking to another art historian, for example, who grew up in deaf culture, as I mentioned, and I talked to them and talked through some of these issues in the paper with them. I think they saw this and were immediately like, you know, this is actually not deaf culture, right? And is this being used as just a kind of stand-in for deaf culture? Is this a kind of form is this a kind of appropriation that flattens and that reduces and does all those things that I think we rightly criticize appropriation for. And I think that there's one way to go back to your question in which this might be mobilized in that sense. But I guess for me, you know, this also reminds me of the richness of deaf culture itself and the fact that, you know, ASL, for example, is a privilege. It's an educational privilege. It's something that people learn, and so you know, various kind of people in the deaf community learn. And so someone who's on a subway passing this out is doing it as also a means of kind of gathering money. Maybe perhaps has ASL or doesn't. You know, there's a kind of impossibility of that. But with Martin, you know, as I mentioned, there are different kinds of love. I think there's a possessive love and there's a selfless love. And even though he's kind of taking this painting in his work, taking these motifs in his work, note, again, the way he paints each of these hands and the way, you know, they're different skin tones, but he pays so much attention to each of them. You know, the source material is flat. There's a kind of schematic flattening, and he gives them back flesh. And so I think that although, again, those difficulties and that kind of perhaps flattening or that access we have, or that he had to deaf culture might not be the fullness of it, but I think it's something a little different than just a kind of flattening cultural appropriation. Something that, you know, is perhaps a kind of clumsy gesture of connection, but still a gesture of connection, you know. And so I think that we can begin to perhaps parse out like issues of Chinatown, Orientalism, kind of cultural appropriation, not not dismissing the pernicious uses they've been put to or the historical uses that they've been put to, which are all there, but thinking about them specifically in terms of an artist like this, for example, and realizing that, you know, these things need to be taken in their full complexity and specificity, I guess.
Kind of relating both parts of your lecture, I think it makes me think about myself and my friends who are Asian Americans, and a lot of times I hear my friends be like, "Yeah, look at those fobs for Asian tourists.
Yeah.
I can't stand dealing with fobs," and then they don't realize that.
Yeah.
I can be considered as a fob too, or whatever that means, and then these people are the same people that fight for Asian American equality. And then at the same time, in your personal life, you are dividing yourself and people who just came to the States like me, or not just, but like, or even their parents who were fobs. So, and then you mentioned Yoko Ono as an Asian American, and whereas from my point of view, she's an Asian.
Yes. So this is something we basically spend all of our time talking about in our class. Bernard could tell you, or some of it. And I think that those are both really good and important points. You know, I grew up in Orange County, California. Is anyone from Orange County?
Not.
Okay. Where are you from? Okay, I'm from Irvine. I went to a predominantly like 50 to 55% Asian high school, and I remember those conversations. You know, I remember the Chinese kids hung out together, the Filipino kids hung out together, the fobs hung out together, and you realize, kind of growing up in that community, that it's not homogenous, that there are different experiences comprised within it, you know, and I would say that I didn't even know the kind of negative connotations of that, for example, when I was growing up. It's something that I kind of, I guess, discovered later, or someone told me later. So what I would say is that, this idea of Asian or Asian American, I guess I'm less interested in kind of policing the boundaries of those terms, or like trying to figure out the right label for someone, as I am in thinking about it as a kind of historical thing, a historical formation that originated in 1968-69 in the Bay Area as a means of forming collectivity. Right, in order actually to fight kind of American colonialism and kind of create a kind of, I guess, powerful political bloc, right? And so that's the history of that term. And so yes, like it does all sorts of abstracting work, like any abstract work does. But I guess, as I said, I'm less interested in those definitions and those terms of who we are and like where we should slot people in than I am in like thinking about the paint application on a canvas and what that does for bricks. And maybe that's apolitical, or maybe that's again withdrawal. But I guess what I'm interested in is, why are those two things in false opposition to each other? Why can't we think like kind of politics and kind of imaginative practices like this? Why do we have to be one or the other always? Why can't we be both? Like, why can't we kind of think through our creative lives, or kind of think through and value kind of the intensity and the love and the imagination that you see on this canvas, and not oppose that to kind of political action? Questions or comments? And I guess what the last thing I would say is that I really think everyone has to find their own way through these issues and questions. That the way that I found is very particular to me and my background, and the struggles and like the things that are important to me and that I faced, and that there are, what I've shared with you is extremely subjective. And I'm in awe of my students in Asian American art class. Like, I think they challenge me, they have taught me just as much as I've taught them, and have held me to a higher standard than I would have held myself. And I think that, so I value their kind of knowledge and their activism and their kind of approach. And I don't think that this is the only way to be in the world. It's just the way that I found, I guess, to be in the world. So that's what I would say. Thank you.